In 334 BC, the world answered to a single superpower, the Persian Achaemenid Empire. It was a behemoth, a sprawling civilization defined by staggering wealth, absolute power, and what seemed like a bottomless well of soldiers. Standing against this giant was a 20-year-old king from the mountains of Macedonia, a place many Greeks considered a backwater. He had a small army, not much money, and a reputation that was mostly his father's. Nobody saw what was coming. Nobody believed he could bring the whole Persian Empire crashing down in just 10 years. How did a man so young, from a kingdom so small, pull off what no one thought was possible? This is the story of his unstoppable march across 3 continents and the battlefield strategies that kept him undefeated. Our story doesn't kick off with a battle, but with an assassination. In 336 BC, King Philip II of Macedon, the military genius who had forced the bickering city-states of Greece to unite, was murdered by his own bodyguard. His son Alexander inherited the throne. He was only 20. Before the ink on his royal decree could even dry, the empire his father built started to wobble. Across Greece, states saw their chance to break free. Rebellions flared up. They saw a boy on the throne and figured he was weak. It was a catastrophic mistake. Alexander's response wasn't a diplomatic note, it was a lightning strike. In 335 BC, hearing that the great city of Thebes was in open revolt, he marched his army 300 miles in just 13 days, a speed that was almost unheard of in the ancient world. The Thebans thought he was still weeks away when his army just appeared at their gates. They were stunned. Alexander destroyed the city, sending a brutal and terrifying message to the rest of Greece. The son is just as formidable as the father. With Greece now held in a grip of fear and respect, Alexander turned his eyes to his father's ultimate goal, the invasion of Persia. He wasn't just picking up the plan, he was about to launch it into overdrive. He gathered his army, a professional fighting machine forged by his father, and prepared to cross into Asia. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood at the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe and Asia. He hurled a spear into Asian soil, declaring he accepted the continent as a gift from the gods. It was a profoundly arrogant and confident gesture. His army, while outnumbered, was something new. It was a combined arms force where heavy infantry, light infantry, and cavalry worked together in perfect lethal harmony. His first test came almost immediately on the banks of the Granicus River. The local Persian governors had scraped together an army to toss him back into the sea. They held the high ground on the opposite bank, a textbook defensive position. Any conventional general would have waited. But Alexander's genius was that he threw the textbook out the window. He saw hesitation as an opening for the enemy. He ordered an immediate attack. Personally leading his elite companion cavalry, Alexander charged straight across the river and up the muddy bank, right into the teeth of the Persian line. It was an almost suicidally bold move. He was right in the thick of it, a whirlwind of bronze and fury. A Persian nobleman stunned him with an axe blow, and he was nearly killed before his bodyguard, Clytus the Black, saved his life. But the sheer shock and violence of the charge shattered the enemy's nerve. The Macedonian cavalry tore a hole in the Persian line, the infantry phalanx pushed relentlessly behind them, and the enemy broke and ran. The Battle of the Granicus was a stunning victory, won by speed, audacity, and Alexander's terrifying presence at the very front of the charge. The wind threw the gates of Asia Minor wide open, and city after city surrendered to the young king. Alexander's early success sent a jolt through the Persian Empire. This wasn't some border raid, this was a full-blown invasion. So the Persian king, Darius III, the most powerful man on the planet, decided to deal with this Macedonian upstart himself. He gathered the vast resources of his empire and assembled a colossal army to finally crush Alexander. In November of 333 BC, the two kings met on a narrow coastal plain at Issus. And right there, Darius made a fatal error. By choosing to fight on this cramped battlefield, stuck between the mountains and the sea, he completely canceled out his biggest advantage: his numbers. The massive Persian army couldn't fully deploy, turning their strength into a dense, confused traffic jam of soldiers. Alexander, always a master of using terrain, saw the opportunity instantly. The battle began. The Macedonian phalanx, a terrifying wall of 18-foot pikes, marched forward and pinned the Persian center. But the decisive move, as it so often was, came from Alexander himself. Leading his companion cavalry on the right wing, he once again led a direct all-or-nothing charge. He wasn't just aiming for the flank, he was aiming for one person, Darius. He smashed through the Persian left wing, made a brilliant turn, and slammed his cavalry into the Persian center where Darius stood in his war chariot. For a moment, the two kings were in direct conflict. But the sight of Alexander and his elite horsemen, caked in dust and blood, charging straight for him was too much. Darius, the king of kings, turned his chariot around and fled. The king's flight was the signal for the entire army to collapse. The battle devolved into a rout, a horrific slaughter as the panicked Persian soldiers were trapped and cut down. The victory at Issus was the real turning point. Alexander hadn't just beaten a Persian army. He had personally made its king run for his life, shattering the myth of Persian invincibility. After that incredible victory, a lesser general might have chased Darius deep into Persia. But Alexander was a master strategist, not just a battlefield tactician. He knew the Persian Empire was a naval power, and its fleet still ruled the seas, threatening his supply lines. So he made a calculated move. Before going east, he would march south down the Mediterranean coast and take every single Persian naval base. This led him, in 332 BC, to the island city of Tyre. Tyre was thought to be impregnable. It was an island fortress half a mile offshore, with walls that ran right down to the sea. They had a powerful navy and figured they could simply wait out any attack. When Alexander demanded they surrender, they killed his messengers and threw them off the walls. It was a fatal insult. Alexander's response was one of the most incredible feats of military engineering in history. He ordered his army to build a causeway, a land bridge, right across the sea to the island. For 7 grueling months, his soldiers toiled, dumping rock and timber into the water while under constant attack from Tyrian ships. The Tyrians sent fire ships to burn his siege towers and fought with desperate courage. At one point, even Alexander thought about giving up. But his will was iron. He scraped together a fleet from other conquered cities, blockaded Tyre by sea, and pushed his causeway forward. He built 150-foot-high siege towers, rolled them to the end of the mole, and hammered the city walls without mercy. Finally, the walls were breached. The Macedonian soldiers, furious after the long and bloody siege, poured into the city. The revenge was brutal. Around 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the fighting. Another 30,000 were sold into slavery. In a final act of horrifying retribution, Alexander had 2,000 men of military age crucified along the beach. The 7-month siege was a testament to his relentless, terrifying determination. With the coast now secure, Alexander marched into Egypt. The Egyptians, who hated Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. There, they crowned him pharaoh, a living god king, and he founded the city that would carry his name for millennia, Alexandria. With the entire Mediterranean coast under his thumb, his rear secured, and his treasury flush with Egyptian gold, Alexander was finally ready for the death blow. He marched his army east into Mesopotamia, looking for one last decisive fight with Darius. In 331 BC, on a wide, flat plain near a village called Gaugamela, he got his wish. Darius had learned his lesson from Issus. This time, he chose the battlefield, a massive open plain where his gigantic army could finally use its numbers to surround and crush the smaller Macedonian force. He even had fearsome scythed chariots, which he was so confident in that he had the ground leveled to make sure they'd be effective. Alexander, facing an army that dwarfed his own, came up with a plan of breathtaking genius. He arranged his army at an angle, with his right wing pushed forward and his left held back. He even created a second line of infantry in reserve, just in case he got encircled. The plan was a giant bait-and-switch, deliberately lure the Persian cavalry to stretch out their own lines, creating a gap in the center. The battle started. Alexander led his cavalry far out to the right, almost as if he were riding away from the fight. Darius, afraid of being outflanked, sent his own cavalry to stop him. As more and more Persian cavalry got sucked into this fight on the wing, the moment Alexander was waiting for arrived. A gap opened in the Persian line right near the center where Darius was. In an instant, Alexander wheeled his cavalry into a giant wedge and charged straight into that gap, making a beeline for Darius. It was the exact same strategy as Isis, cut the head off the snake. And for the second time, the sight of Alexander's unstoppable charge was too much for Darius. He fled. For the third and final time, the King of Kings abandoned his army. The Persian command structure dissolved into chaos. On the other side of the field, Alexander's left flank was in serious trouble and close to breaking. But Alexander, resisting the urge to chase Darius, broke off his attack to ride to their rescue, saving his army from disaster. The Battle of Gaugamela was Alexander's tactical masterpiece. It was a total victory. The Persian Empire was finished. Alexander marched into the legendary cities of Babylon and Susa, and finally to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, which he burned to the ground. A final symbolic act of revenge for Persia's invasion of Greece more than a century earlier. You'd think conquering the Persian Empire would be enough. It wasn't. For the next several years, Alexander pushed his army ever eastward into the hostile, unknown lands of what are now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. He founded city after city, many named Alexandria, to act as garrisons and centers of Greek culture while fighting brutal guerrilla wars against fierce local tribes. By 326 BC, he reached India. On the banks of the Hydaspes River, he faced his strangest enemy yet, King Porus and his army of war elephants. The Macedonians had never seen anything like these beasts in battle. Faced with a monsoon-swollen river and Porus's army waiting on the far bank, Alexander again turned to deception and speed. He made a series of elaborate bluffs, making it look like he was searching for a place to cross, until the Indian king finally relaxed his guard. Then, under the cover of a thunderstorm, Alexander led a large part of his army across the river at an unguarded spot. The battle that followed was one of Alexander's bloodiest. His cavalry outmaneuvered the Indian army, while his phalanx had to face the terrifying charge of the war elephants. But the Macedonians adapted, targeting the elephants' drivers and wounding the panicked animals with their pikes until the beasts turned and trampled their own troops. It was a hard-won, but decisive victory. Alexander was so impressed by the bravery of Porus that he spared his life and made him an ally. But this battle was a different kind of turning point. Alexander wanted to push on to the great river Ganges, to what he thought was the edge of the world. But his army had finally had enough. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years, thousands of miles from home. They were exhausted, homesick, and terrified by stories of even bigger Indian armies with thousands more elephants. At the Ephesus River, they mutinied. For the first time, Alexander's men refused his orders. He pleaded, he threatened, he even sulked in his tent for 3 days, but their will was finally broken. Reluctantly, the undefeated king agreed to turn back. The unstoppable march had finally been stopped, not by an enemy, but by the sheer human exhaustion of his own men. The journey home was a nightmare. Alexander split his forces. Part of the army sailed down the Indus River, but he led the main group on a horrific march through the Gudrasian desert. It was a catastrophic blunder. Thousands of his soldiers died of thirst and starvation in the barren wasteland. It was the single greatest disaster his army ever suffered. When he finally got back to the heart of his new empire, Alexander began working on his grand vision, a fusion of Greek and Persian cultures. He started wearing Persian clothes, encouraged his soldiers to marry Asian women, and brought Persians into his army and government. This was a hugely controversial policy. His proud Macedonian veterans felt it was a betrayal of their traditions, and tensions grew. In 324 BC, his best friend and lifelong companion, Hephaestion, died, which sent Alexander into a deep and inconsolable grief. A year later, in June of 323 BC, after a long banquet in Babylon, Alexander himself fell ill with a fever. He died just days later. He was only 32 years old. The man who conquered the known world, who never lost a single battle, was defeated by an illness. His death created a massive power vacuum. His vast empire, held together by the sheer force of his personality, had no clear heir. When his generals asked him on his deathbed who he left his kingdom to, he supposedly whispered, "To the strongest." What followed wasn't a continuation of his vision, but 50 years of brutal civil war as his generals, the Diadochi, tore his empire into pieces to create their own kingdoms. Alexander's empire didn't outlive him, but his legacy is immeasurable. In just 10 years, a 20-year-old king from a corner of northern Greece redrew the map of the world. His conquests smashed the old empires and kickstarted a new chapter in history, the Hellenistic Age, a time when Greek language, culture, and ideas spread from Egypt all the way to India. His battlefield strategies, the integrated use of infantry and cavalry, the obsession with speed and surprise, and the audacious leader-led charge to take out the enemy command are still studied in military academies today. He was a brilliant tactician, a master strategist, and an inspirational leader who fought right alongside his men. He was ambitious, ruthless, and driven by a vision that went to the very edges of the known world and beyond. Alexander was more than a conqueror. He was a force of history who, in a single blazing decade, built an empire and changed the world forever. If you enjoyed this look at the strategies of Alexander the Great, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories about the greatest military commanders in history. And let us know in the comments which general you think we should cover next.